I would certainly imagine that it is as high as that. I think, they often perhaps they haven't encountered an issue that they've looked at deeply enough to recognize these disparities, or perhaps there are other factors. But I will say that it really wasn't just statins either. I did a number of projects for RAND in which, again, I seem to see these systematic disparities generally in favor of treatment, in representations of the evidence and in guidelines relative to the published evidence. So it wasn't really even just the statin issue.
Well, you have an MD and a PhD, but prior to some of your, I think our listeners may begin to appreciate some of the motivation behind this, is that weren't you the scientific director for the Department of Veterinary Affairs and Research and Advisory Committee on the Gulf Veterans War illnesses, so you've had formal training in this area where that may predispose you to being more sensitive to the specifics that many other physicians are just not attuned to.
I would perhaps phrase it the other way. I think part of the reason I got interested in the Gulf War area was I was already concerned at that point about the way that inferences were drawn about that condition. I was approached by the head of the RAND Health program to ask if I wanted to be involved in a set of reports related to Gulf War illness, and I had seen the conclusions of the Institute of Medicine and the Presidential Advisory Committee reports relevant to Gulf War illness at that time, and this was in the 1990s. And those reports essentially rephrasing what they said to make more clear the way the inferences were drawn. The inferences were basically absence of proof of a connection between organic factors and illness was interpreted as proof of absence of a connection between organic factors and illness. And since no one had looked and therefore no one had proved that the exposures that they had received were related to their illness, these then concluded that there couldn't be a relationship. But you couldn't conclude there was no relationship because there was no evidence, because nobody had looked or even asked if it was biologically plausible and therefore merited more inquiry. So I jumped at the chance to participate, not because I had any conclusion in either direction about whether Gulf War veterans were ill or whether it was related to exposures that they had experienced, but because I felt that an honest inquiry hadn't really taken place, and I wanted to make sure that one was. And when closer inquiry did take place, it was clear that some of the exposures that Gulf War veterans had strong biological plausibility as precipitants for their illness. And I outlined in one of my reports a research plan that would help to evaluate whether, in fact, there was a causal relationship. And now a number of those studies have been done, including I suggested that we look at the genetic variants of the enzymes that detoxify some of the chemicals they were exposed to, on grounds that if these chemicals were causally linked to illness, then people who have sluggish variants of these detoxifying chemicals should be more likely to be ill. And sure enough, they are. And people who had higher levels of exposure to these chemicals would be more likely to be ill. And sure enough, they are. In animal studies exposing animals to these chemicals, I suggested we should look at long-term effects, which might differ not only in amount but in direction from short-term effects. And sure enough, those long-term studies have shown that if you look long after exposure, you identify new abnormalities that weren't present immediately after exposure. So in that case, it wasn't, I think, just the fact that I was involved that conditioned me to be concerned about evidence, but in fact it was the concern about evidence that conditioned me to be involved.
All right. Well, thank you for that clarification. There's collectively, I believe, the largest drug companies earn about $500 billion. That's $500 billion annually, and that's certainly quite a bit of revenue that one can use for a variety of reasons. From your investigation, what percentage of studies that are currently being published in the medical clinical area are actually being funded by the drug companies either directly or indirectly?
I've never looked at that question, and it would very much depend on how you ask the question. Mm-hmm. Certainly in the case of statin trials, which are the area that I'm probably most closely familiar with, all of the large randomized control trials are drug company funded. All of them.
All of them. Not just the majority. Your review, and this is your area of expertise, and you've carefully looked at this, and your conclusion is that all of them are funded by the drug companies. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
Yeah, all of the large randomized control trials are drug company funded, right?
That is just profound.
It's very expensive to do those studies. The only other source of funding for reasonable size studies is the NIH, and we had approached the NIH actually to to conduct a study to see whether coenzyme Q10 might mitigate muscle side effects of statins, and we were told by NIH officers that they wouldn't even consider a lot of requests to do the study unless we asked the drug company to supply the statin that was used in the study. And so I contacted the NIH and I said, I'm really trying to have a career free of drug company conflict of interest. Would it be such a problem to have one study that doesn't have drug company involvement? And they said somewhat reasonably, that their interest is in leveraging their funding, and therefore, no, they would not consider an application unless we asked the drug company to supply the drug, which of course already sets up some level of conflict of interest. So the problem is there are finite funds available for research, and the NIH, which is the only other source of sizable funds, generally not quite as sizable as are required for the really large drug studies, they also have an interest in, as they say, leveraging their resources and providing funding to a larger number of trials, which then motivates further conflict of interest issues associated with academic participation.
Let me just interject here for those listeners who aren't familiar with the NIH. That's an acronym for the National Institutes of Health, and is really the government sponsored and funded health agency. And as you mentioned, really next to the drug companies, the largest single source of funding for these studies. And when one independent, objective, truth-oriented and seeking researcher seeks to go and do these conflict of interest-free trials, you're obviously going to need funds to do that. When you go to the only other option really that's available, the NIH, they're refusing to do it because they want to, quote unquote, leverage their ties with the drug companies, which is just extraordinary. But
they want to leverage their money, and one of the ways to do that has the unfortunate side effect of producing ties to industry. And so I will say that there may be others, but I am the only researcher of drugs that I am aware of who actually has tried or has so far not had drug company conflicts of interest. Now,
I'm particularly curious, too, about the coenzyme Q10 issue that you mentioned. Is it true that in Europe, which is clearly a whole different set of a scenario which aren't under necessarily the same guidelines or conflicts of interest that we have in this country, and I'd be interested in your comments on that. Have they done trials, or is it professionally standard of care to actually recommend coenzyme Q10 when they're administering a statin drug? That was my understanding, that it's almost malpractice not to co-administer them when they're giving a statin drug in Europe.
I'm not actually familiar of any standard of that kind. I have heard that, and I would actually need to look this up to verify, but I've heard that in Canada, the labeling on statins mentions that, and that statins lower coenzyme Q10. And I know certainly that in Japan, coenzyme Q10 is approved for treatment for heart failure, but I'm not actually aware one way or another of whether there are those propensities in Europe. I certainly haven't heard that.
From your experience, is the funding somewhat similar? The funding challenge is somewhat similar for objective researchers like yourself in Europe. Are they, or they still have the same challenge with respect to when they're seeking government funding to do a trial, that there's this connection to the drug companies?
I'm going to answer your question a little bit indirectly. Mm-hmm. It's my perception that this is changing in the untoward direction. But some years ago, I was involved in a panel reviewing a set of responses to a contract put out by the NIH. The NIH was interested in people performing studies to evaluate whether more intensive drug treatment for diabetics was superior to standard care, where more intensive drug treatment was for both blood sugar and blood pressure, as well actually as blood cholesterol. And what I found fascinating, so a number of people then proposed designs to do this study and submitted them to the NIH, and this review group was evaluating those studies. And what was fascinating to me was, with perhaps 30 reviewers in the room, there were 3 of us who viewed this as a two-sided question, meaning that more intensive therapy might either be better or it might be worse. And it was me and the 2 reviewers who were not from the United States. One was from Canada.